Hi, welcome to valuationpodcast.com, a podcast and video series about all things related to business and valuation. My name is Melissa Gragg, and I provide online valuation services for mediation and litigation based in St. Louis, Missouri. Today, we'll be discussing divorce, prenups, and parenting plans with Calina Costa Plotky. She's a family law attorney in Atlanta, Georgia with KF Law, LLC. She concentrates primarily on family law, which would include divorce or child custody, child support, modification of maintenance, alimony, prenuptial agreements, and the list goes on. Welcome, Calina. How are you?
Doing pretty good. What about you?
Doing pretty good. So I think that when people are contemplating marriage, it's a very happy time and they're trying to figure out what they should do, what flowers they should pick. But in some cases, they have extensive assets or they have some things that they come into the marriage. And so when we're talking about this concept of a prenuptial agreement, what do you traditionally see included in an agreement like this?
So most of my clients require pretty extensive prenuptial agreements. They usually have businesses that have been already created and have assets and are doing pretty well. They also have separate funds. This might be their second or third marriage, so they might have a substantial amount of assets already, and other financial accounts such as college accounts or previous children, and they want to protect assets that they want to be inherited by solely their biological children, especially if it's a later term marriage. I'm always telling people that you should get a prenup even if you don't have any assets, because I have done marriages where they have been married for 30 years and they started with nothing and they built it all together, but now they're paying me and wasting their entire retirement, paying $100,000 in attorney's fees to fight over a little bit more of the pie. Whereas if you just had a prenup that said everything was 50-50, that would have cost a hell of a lot less to hire an attorney to draft that to begin with versus hiring two attorneys to fight it out later on.
And do you have to think of everything? Like, can you say, okay, you don't get anything, I'm going to keep all of my stuff, and then everything that we create, I'm going to keep that as well. And I'm not going to pay you any alimony. I'm not going to pay child support. Can you include all of that stuff too? Like, that would be great, right?
It would be great. So everything, you can include everything except child support. The biggest thing is you have to have a full and accurate disclosure of all your financial assets and liabilities. That's the number one easiest way to break a prenup in the state of Georgia, is if you do not financially disclose everything. Georgia courts protect prenups above all else. In fact, there are court cases out there that say if you guys have lived together for 5 years prior to signing a prenup, then the other side probably knew what your finances looked like. So your disclosure is adequate if you missed a couple of accounts. But if you're only together for a month before you guys get married, then it's a very different situation. So you want to go through and always put the highest value of the asset. If your property is worth $1 million now, but if you sold it and split it up into 4 lots, it would be worth $10 million, put the $10 million valuation rather than the lower amount of $1 million.
Do you have to have actual valuations for any of the property, or are you just kind of making an educated guess?
So most of it's an educated guess. Of course, a lot of that's a little easier with like Zillow and some of those platforms, which are not accurate, of course, but we can get much closer than just picking a number out of a hat. And usually when it comes down to someone's business, if it's a multi-million-dollar business, we'll usually do 3 or 4 times the gross, and we'll say that we'll offer to pay for a formal evaluation to be done. Now, if the other side doesn't want a formal evaluation and they're willing to take our evaluation, then that's fine. But you always offer to have a formal evaluation done.
Now, what if somebody like, let's say I am getting married. What if my spouse comes to me and says, I'd like you to sign this prenup? What do you recommend? So you're presented with a piece of paper and I read it because, it makes sense. Like, should I do anything else? Or if I've read it and I'm okay with it, is it fine? Or should there be some other things that I do?
So that leads into another great element that's used to break prenups in the state of Georgia is you're supposed to be able to have the opportunity to have your own independent counsel review it. And sometimes I get into cases where there's a large financial disparity. The male might be making $35,000 a year, whereas the female has family money and she's bringing in $10 million a year. So in those cases, we always have our clients pay for the other side to get an independent attorney. So they'll offer to pay for the attorney, but they can hire whoever they want to review it, and we'll work with the other side to come up with any changes that need to be made. But when there's a huge disparity like that, it's best to offer to hire the other person an independent counsel.
Well, and I actually think that that's a really smart idea, because just because somebody is paying for the attorney doesn't mean that attorney works for the person. I mean, obviously, but
Yeah.
I think the prenups that we hear the most about are the ones that are given like weeks or days or hours before the wedding. Now, what's going to be the problem with some of those types of situations?
So here in the state of Georgia, judges do not have a problem with that.
Oh.
Even if you're knocked up and it's the night before the marriage and you get a prenup, and if you sign it and waive your right to have independent counsel review it, then they don't count that as duress. And so it's very hard in the state of Georgia to throw out prenups based on duress or anything like that. Judges believe that you can walk away from the marriage. I mean, yeah, it was planned next day and you spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on it, but that's minuscule comparative to getting into a contract that's going to screw you over in the end.
So there's really no requirements if you've been offered to have, but basically, if you really look at this, you should at a minimum hire an attorney to take a look at it, to maybe offer suggestions or changes, because it's kind of you're negotiating the contract, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, some of those terms can stick in everlasting because you're losing your bargaining power. Because if one side gets very favorable terms in the prenup, you can, of course, amend it later with a postnup, but what's their incentive to do so? Mm-hmm. Especially if they have the most favorable terms to them.
Yeah. And you're not going to know until you get way down the pipeline. But you said an interesting term. So I think people know what a prenup is. It's before the marriage. But what is a postnup or antenup?
So in the state of Georgia, a prenup actually has to be a contract in when you're contemplating marriage. So alimony can't be discussed. It only can be discussed what's to keep separate property and what would happen if one of you died. Now, if you discuss alimony and things like that, it doesn't invalidate the prenup. It just changes it from a prenup to an antenup. And the title doesn't really matter. The same factors are applied to those agreements when you're reviewing those. A postnup is used in the state of Georgia after you get married. Whether you had a prenup before or not, a postnup can ratify that prenup. So that's a good way to make sure the prenup's ironclad and no one can say, oh, it was under duress. You just, a couple of weeks later, you say, yep, everything that we signed before, we ratify, we reaffirm, and we're of sound mind. Or in the postnup, something changes. You win the lottery, or something, you decide to be more generous, something like that, and you guys can change the terms or pay someone out for their marital portion of the equity in a postnup that wasn't considered in a prenup.
Now, if we're looking, so if we have to identify all of the assets that we have and say, okay, I have a house, I have a car, I have a tchotchke set or something, is the only way that we can really protect those assets when, before we get married, is to put together a prenuptial agreement? Or are there some other ways that we could protect like the assets that we came into the marriage, like inheritance and such?
So in the state of Georgia, the inheritance and things that you made prior to the marriage are considered separate property. The best way to keep those separate and continually is obviously to get a prenup or a postnup, but also to keep those in a separate account. Don't commingle them. Even if you do have a prenup, don't commingle them, because then usually when you start commingling stuff, the state of Georgia will still do like a source of funds test, but then we're having to hire forensic accountants, evaluators to go back and look at, okay, you put $50,000 down of your own separate property. How much did that accrue, or how much of the marital funds accrued? And you're getting into a bunch of math, and usually judges throw their hands up and just take what the expert has to say.
Yeah. And I think there are really sophisticated financial planners that are like, okay, here you have an account that's separate and it's premarital, so you had it before the marriage. Sometimes they'll do something different with income and appreciation because certain states have a difference, like in the state of Missouri, income is treated different. So appreciation can remain separate, right? But income on that separate asset is still marital. Do you have a similar type of situation in Georgia?
So in the state of Georgia, it's the source of the funds. So if it's separate, let's say you have an inheritance account that was an IRA that you had $100,000 in, and you were not smart, and after you got married, you started putting marital funds into that. So you can use accountants to extrapolate that $100,000 and then what interest is being accrued on that separate $100,000 and separate that out of the marital asset, which is accruing interest as well. But again, you're getting into thousands of dollars you're paying into experts, where it's just smarter to keep it as a separate account.
Yeah. And I think it's hard because, we live in this arena of divorce. And so I don't think people are always thinking about this when they get married. But hopefully if there is some inheritance or family money, that there are some accountants and attorneys involved even at that process, because there are some ways to protect it. And we've talked about a couple ways to make a prenup ironclad, and it's very interesting that Georgia sees them as so secure, because I think in other states, it's sort of just like part of the process. The first, you have a prenup. Okay, first part is we're going to try to destroy it and get it thrown out. Like, is that the first step that it doesn't seem like Georgia does that?
No, normally if a client comes in with a prenup, the first step is us reviewing. We look if there was a financial disclosure, if it was an adequate financial disclosure, and if they were allowed to have independent counsel. The barrier for like duress and stuff is so high that most people, I don't think I've read a single case in a long time that someone has qualified under that standard for. So those are the first things we look at. And it is the duty of the person who wants to enforce the prenup to file the motion to enforce. So usually that's what happens, and we'll do a review if there was an adequate financial disclosure, if they were given independent counsel to review, and if there was adequate time, even if it was a week or a couple days before the marriage, then that's usually a pretty ironclad prenup in the state of Georgia.
Now, I'm sure you have at least a story or something that you could share, but do you have like a good example of a time where a prenup kind of went wrong or that like had an intent, but didn't really provide that security?
I mean, the craziest stories coming out of Georgia are going to be the financial disclosures. Really, it's going to be when people that make over $1 million a year and have $10 million in assets forget to disclose bank accounts where they have $300,000 in it. And that will invalidate the entire prenup. The judge isn't going to pick sections to validate. They're going to invalidate the whole thing. And even if you try to go back later and do a postnup to reaffirm, the original prenup is void. So there's no point in you trying to do that because you'd have to write a brand new one to try to fix that. But we do get some every once in a while that, is for each year of marriage, you get a couple $100,000 and things like that. So it is very funny to see people come in after that large hike and say, all right, I'm done.
So. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, and I think it's interesting because I agree with you. When you have kind of high net worth individuals or second marriages, third marriages, hopefully not fourth marriages, but they happen. I think that they may lose track of where a random account is, or that the random account existed. And that is a very interesting. I think it's also kind of how do you prove it? Like going back to prove the existence of it also has some complications. But
yeah, people are usually not as smart as they think they are in their head, because especially when they're in love and engaged, right, about to get married, they'll like send emails about screwing over their ex-spouse and like not even realize they're disclosing accounts that they hadn't told the other person about, and all sorts of things where you're screwing over one person without realizing that this new person is taking note of all this because you're probably going to try to screw them over in the exact same way.
Yeah. So. Yeah. And it really is a sticky mess because I think, back in the day, they used to say, if you need to get a prenup, then maybe you shouldn't be getting married. But you have a little bit different take on it. And I would agree because I'm in the same field, is that you think everyone should probably do a prenup, right?
Yep. I do. I mean, I'm in Georgia, right? So I'm a Southern girl. So I carry a firearm. Most people here in the state of Georgia do. And I explain it to my Southern friends the same way, is a prenup is like having a gun. You have a gun to protect yourself. The actual percentage that you're actually going to ever have to fire your firearm in self-defense is so low. Think of the prenup the same way, is it's there to protect you. And believe it or not, a lot of people who do get prenups are usually the ones less likely to use it in the event of a divorce.
Well, because you've talked about how you're going to do this, like you already, and if you don't like that, then you should say no. And you should get somebody else to negotiate with you or for you on your behalf, those types of things. So the interesting part is we decided to talk about prenups and parenting plans. And I don't really know why we did it like that, but it kind of all rhymes or maybe goes together. But I thought that this was really, so like you get the prenup, you get the postnup, you're in wedded bliss for 1, 3, 5, 30 years. And then you have a couple kids, right? And I think the other piece that people don't always understand is like what goes into, like, let's say you decided to get divorced. A lot of times people are going to say, well, my spouse is really just a horrible person. And so they shouldn't have custody of the kids. I'm the better parent, this and that. Or sometimes they cheated on me or they decided to leave, like all of these reasons. But what are some of the real factors that go into determining like how custody is handled in a divorce in Georgia?
So I like to tell my clients, usually when you're married, there's a primary parent and there's a secondary parent. Let's just admit it. One person goes to the doctors, one person does the teacher conferences and things like that. Usually the court's going to look at that. I can't tell you how many times I've asked the non-primary parent from the marriage who the doctor is of the child, who the teacher is of the child, and they have no idea. And that's because they didn't take on that role, but they want to step up and take on that role now to be the primary parent, usually out of spite or because they don't want to pay as much child support. But it always falls back into the best interest standard for the child, which one of the factors is if you can co-parent with the other parent, if you can communicate, if you can do what's best for the child, because there are two parents, whether one's primary and whether one's secondary, you're still going to need to make discussions. You're going to have good faith efforts before having big medical changes, religion changes, and school changes. And so the court looks at that. They look at who has been the primary parent in the past. And, if the kids are old enough, they'll ask the kids and they'll talk to the kids here in the state of Georgia too.
Well, and are there certain things that can make somebody just totally lose custody? Or even if you just talk a little bit about physical versus, what's the other one? Custody, physical or legal custody? What does that even matter? Does it matter?
So legal custody comes down to whether your voice gets to be heard when the primary physical parent is making major decisions. It also, if you can contact the doctors and things like that, it is extremely rare in the state of Georgia to get sole legal custody, because that cuts off a parent's ability to communicate with the schools, the teachers, doctors, things like that. So it rarely happens that someone gets sole legal custody. It's usually joint custody, and then we give tiebreaker decisions in four more major areas, which is education, non-emergency health, religion, and extracurriculars. And usually it gets divided somehow, depending on who has more time or less time. And then physical custody, residential custody goes to usually the person that's been that primary parent in the relationship and in the marriage. Now, of course, if there's physical abuse with the child, that's obviously going to be a huge factor. But it's rare that you get cases where one parent is going to be a terrible parent that shouldn't have any rights. It's usually they're both good parents. They're just not good partners together.
Right. Yeah. And I think that in that process, I think that, in a lot of states, it may be that there's traditionally not sole legal custody or sole physical custody for a reason, right? Because or else everybody would try to go after those reasons to get full custody, because kids sort of do become a little bit in the middle, or pawns that are used to either not pay as much money, or because typically one party loves the kids and will do anything for the kids, and the other one's like, how far can I push this love for the kids? And that's a hard area to be in. But as they get divorced and they're going through the process, they have to start kind of figuring out how they're going to co-parent. And co-parenting is sort of just a concept that you understand in the midst of divorce, but in that aspect, you start to talk about it and you start to put together a parenting plan. And I think different states can call them different words. But what is traditionally included in a parenting plan?
Usually the regular schedule, so whatever that is during the child's school year, even if the children aren't in regular school yet, we usually use that calendar to go off of. And then you do the summer schedule as well as major holiday schedules. parenting plans can be as detailed as we need them to be or as ambiguous as we need them to be. So if I'm representing a parent who is getting primary custody and I know they're going to get primary custody, then I might leave out all those 3-day holidays like Martin Luther King Day, President's Day, stuff like that, because I know more than likely that weekend's going to line up with my client's weekend anyway, and I don't want to take away less time from my client. However, on the flip side, if I know I'm representing the secondary parent and I know they're going to be the secondary parent, then I might want all those weekends included because it gives them potential to have more of those weekends. And honestly, a lot of the things too, we take our clients' cue. I have had parenting plans that are 15 pages where there's provisions that each parent has to give the medicine prescribed to the child. I never thought that would need to be in one. We're literally going back to court for contempt for that provision. And even when it comes to tiebreaker on, let's say, medical decisions, we can write parenting plans in such a way that basically the tiebreaker gets to decide if the sky is blue. Whereas if we have one parent that's over treating a child and another parent that is just completely uninterested in medical decisions, how we do it is we'll say, okay, you follow the recommendations of the primary care physician. If a parent disagrees with that primary care physician, they can get a secondary opinion. If that doctor who gave a secondary opinion disagrees with the first, then they both jointly, the doctors, have to come up with a third tie-breaking doctor. And so essentially it gives doctors all the decisions rather than the parents. Now, I don't think that's usually the best way to go about something, but when we have parents that absolutely refuse to agree with each other on things like that, that's what we do, or we tell them they have to go to a mediator every time they disagree.
Yeah, and I think that we'll see them quite often in mediation because you can go mediate an issue afterwards. Or it seems like if you can identify a tiebreaker, somebody that maybe both of you trust, then that person could also be, but people come in and out of lives. I think that one thing though, that when people are and when they're at this place and they need to start considering what they're going to put in their parenting plan, I think they need, a lot of times I will tell people to at least identify the areas that have traditionally had some conflict in it. So if you guys have always argued about summer camp, right? One thinks you should go, one thinks you shouldn't, one thinks you should go out of state, one thinks you should go local, I think those are good places to start. But are there other, because you don't want to complicate it too much, but is there like a checklist, or do you get people thinking about the things that are important to them about the kids and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we ask what is important to each person. So I had my daughter at 20 outside of a marriage. And so when we did the legitimation process and stuff like that, I'll never forget that at that time, usually fathers, the secondary parent, got tiebreaker for extracurricular activities. And so when his attorney came in and said that, I said, no, I want tiebreaker in extracurricular. He can have religion. And her face, she looked like she had seen a ghost. But neither of us were very religious. He is now because of his wife, and that's great. But I'm not very religious. But I knew he would block extracurricular activities because of the expense of extracurricular activities. And I also put that in there too. Like if they have tiebreaker and you think they're going to pick the most expensive extracurricular like space camp at NASA, then we can put a cap on it. Like if there's a yearly allowance of $1,000 for extracurricular, and then they can still enroll them. It's just at their cost.
Yeah. And that's how I think you can treat a few, like private school, college, for some people, thinking about all of that when you have a little kid is a lot. But I think all attorneys in every state have kind of just regular things, regular, it's not even tricks. It's more just like suggestions of how to deal with, like in the state of Missouri, sometimes they'll say, okay, you can go to, you'll split the cost for a college at a certain level. But beyond that, you kind of have to get buy-in, from both parents to pay for something like that. And I think that those are the more difficult, or where the child will go to school for grade school. And then who's going to pay for it? So a lot of that. Do you see that there are times where there could be uneven payments of things, or do you always see like 50-50 payment for things?
So I don't see 50-50 payment of things when there's an income disparity. So, if father is making $1 million a year, mother's making 35, then he's paying like 90% of those out-of-pocket expenses. And it's based on like the child support worksheet, a percentage gets popped out, and that's what we use. But yeah, we try to limit all the things that they can tie you into extra cost in addition to child support. So private school's a great example as well. If you, in most of my parenting plans, if you both don't agree on a private school, then, and the tiebreaker decides to put them in private school anyway, then they don't have to pay any of the cost. The other parent doesn't have to pay any of the cost. And here in the state of Georgia, unfortunately, parents can kick their kids out at 18 after they graduated high school, give them a pat on the head and say, see you later. So no court in the state of Georgia is going to require a parent to pay college costs. It's just not going to happen. So in a lot of my cases, I'll have parents that say, yeah, if I have the money, then I'm going to pay for it. But I don't want to put it in an agreement or an order where I'm going to be held in contempt if I don't have the money and I can't pay it.
Yeah. And I think that that's sometimes the biggest concern, that people will kick some of those decisions to the time, hoping that maybe they're going to get along better at that point. But again, I also have clients that are like, well, I'm only going to pay if they go to this school, the school that I went to. Right. And I think that at least having the discussion and kind of uncovering the issue, is there an issue? Because sometimes you'll be like, okay, well, you can work that out. Okay, we can work that out. But then you'll hit a couple that are like, oh, we can't even agree when we're talking about it. And in my mind, it's just a good exercise to at least walk down the path of what would you do? What would I do? Kind of situation. But again, they can always mediate it, but I think that part of it is they're trying to figure out how to co-parent going forward. You touched a little bit on child support. I know a lot of states have different kind of structured ways to develop child support. Is Georgia one of those states? So it's like a calculator.
Yeah, our legislature created a calculator. It's an online calculator. When I fill out a child support worksheet, I can actually release it to the judge in the courtroom. And so they can make changes. And pretty much the only thing that's guaranteed to be put in our child support worksheets that you don't need judge's discretion for is the gross income of each party and health insurance. Whoever pays the child's health insurance, the child's portion of that health insurance is automatically guaranteed to be placed in. Everything else, such as extracurricular activities, or if there's extraordinary medical costs, if a child has cancer, God forbid, or anything like that, and it's a known quantity, it's all up to the judge's discretion whether they want to put it in the child support worksheet or keep it out and use the percentages that the child support worksheet pops out for out-of-pocket medical expenses, and they just use that percentage when it comes to daycare, childcare, camps, stuff like that.
Yeah, I think we get involved a lot when it's when they can't determine what the income to put on one of the parents is. So that's usually, so for kind of our viewers, that's usually where the disagreement comes from, is like what income everybody makes, especially in a pandemic and in COVID and all this good stuff. But then the calculation is consistent for everybody kind of going through the process in Georgia and a lot of states.
Yeah, we still have the issue with income when people own their own businesses, right? Because there's a lot of things you'll swipe the credit card for that isn't going to be on your W-2 if you W-2 yourself. And then, of course, my clients always complain that our child support worksheet uses gross income, which is prior to taxes. So everybody's like, I don't take this home. And I'm like, I know, I'm sorry. This is what the legislature told us we're doing. So,
yeah. Yeah. And that's, I think that what you alluded to is, we call in the industry the double dip, which is if you're using income for the valuation, and then you're also using the same income for child support or maintenance or alimony, that's a big no-no, basically.
yep.
And people are like, okay, I don't care about that. But yeah, that is a big. Now, what about maintenance? Do you guys have any kind of also guidelines the same as child support in Georgia?
No, we don't. So, I mean, the only absolute rule we have in the state of Georgia is if you have an affair, then you can't receive alimony. You're barred. That's an absolute bar from alimony here in the state of Georgia. However, we don't have just a simple worksheet or anything like that. Most judges will look at half the life of the marriage, but those are now tending to be our older male judges. Our female judges are now looking at alimony as rehabilitation alimony. So, okay, you took time off from your career or you stopped your college education. How much do we need to give you to go through with that college education and so that you can get back on your feet and things like that. So it really depends on the length of the marriage, but it's extremely rare nowadays to get lifetime alimony in the state of Georgia.
Welcome to the state of Missouri. So the judges don't really have the capacity to limit the term of maintenance, which is interesting. But every state, I mean, but that should be kind of something that we do talk about, is that every state is different, and the state that you get divorced in are the laws that are govern all of this. And so what you're talking about is just Georgia. I'm in Missouri. I know Illinois and some other states too, but it really is important to find somebody that understands all of these, because half of the things that you've said today, I wouldn't have known from operating in a different state, right? And they can really trip you up. Like the fact that if there's infidelity, there's no maintenance, like, wow, that's a pretty big deal, because that's like, the majority of cases.
Right. Yeah. No, if you cheated, you can't receive alimony. And it has to be a legal affair, which then we're getting into the definition, which is probably more PG-13 than.
Right. Yeah.
But
and in this
family law is extremely state specific. That's why I tell people, especially when they watch my videos, I'll get comments all the time on my TikTok videos that's like, no, you're wrong. And I'm like, well, I'm completely correct in the state I practice in, but in your state, it might be completely different.
And let's talk about, because, we've talked about all of the fun divorce stuff, but let's talk about how I saw you, which is on TikTok. But you're a young attorney and kind of, out there trying to grow your own practice. And how have you looked at social? I mean, because you're putting yourself out there, and you're putting yourself out there on TikTok very personally. Like I'm kind of proud of you, because I look like a fool half the time if I try to show too much of my personal life. But what have you found that has been helpful in putting yourself out in social media?
I mean, I found that, it definitely fosters immunity. Another thing that, especially when it comes to TikTok videos, that the older generation, and I'm including myself, millennials and all the way up,
we're all too old for TikTok.
Right? Really don't understand about TikTok and things like that, is that people really get to see a part of my personality. They get to see how much I care about cases, how much I care about my clients, how much time and effort I devote to not only my law practice, but to my family life as well. And that makes a huge difference, especially with younger millennials and Gen Z starting to hire attorneys. Because, I mean, the old way of doing things when I hired my attorney when I was 20 was you went and you looked at websites, you looked at reviews. I mean, there wasn't any way other than going and doing a consultation that you usually had to pay for to get to know an attorney. And unfortunately, there are bad attorneys out there. It's a product of what we do. And, you know, when I come up against them in my practice, I try to report them to the bar so that other people don't get taken advantage of. But with these videos, it really gives people an opportunity to see who I am. And I mean, right now I have 8 cases that came from TikTok. I'm practicing in counties in the state of Georgia I didn't even know existed.
I love it. I love it. Well, but you have a good point, because I tell people to definitely meet an attorney and talk to them before they hire them, right? Duh, right? That makes sense. But part of it is because there's a lot of attorneys that have a great pedigree and they have a great CV and their resume is impeccable. But this is a person, and unfortunately, this is just the reality, is that divorce is not typically a quick process. And especially right now when the courts are backed up and we're having just huge dockets that aren't moving because of the pandemic, this is somebody that you're going to be kind of hanging out with, right? And I think that the more you don't have to like them, like you don't have to hang out with them, but if you don't trust them, or if you feel like you can't talk to them about your situation, you're going to end up probably switching attorneys at some point in what I've seen experience wise. And so I think it's amazing to put yourself out there. Is TikTok your favorite, or are you other places?
Yeah. TikTok is definitely my favorite. I of course have Instagram, but I get told I photo really well, but I have a very energetic personality. So, 15 seconds is way better than seeing a flat photo of me.
True. And because in photos, we're all like serious. We're like, professional and like,
right.
I think it's much different. It also, I thought that some of your videos were very entertaining because it kind of sheds a light into our world of getting prepped for trial, of like going in like guns a-blazing, right? That people don't really understand. Like it's some serious hype mode that we have to go in to go to trial. Now, have you been doing some, I know the state of Georgia is doing like Zoom trials and things like that. How do you feel the community has taken on to that?
We're doing video. I still have some judges in my rural counties that refuse to learn how to use Zoom. So I'm still going in person. And we've had an emergency order extended several times where we can't have jury trials. So legitimately all our courts are hearing right now are family law cases. It is burning us all out, but usually the best family law attorneys are the ones that are willing to give up sleep and time with our families to move our clients' cases forward, because we see people in agony. And I tell my clients all the time, I have plenty of other people that are willing to pay me. I don't need to keep cases around. If I can move your case forward, I'll do everything I can to make sure that I get you a good resolution, and not have something hanging around. Because we are, more so than any other area of law, I think we're counselors first, and we're helping people, we're saving people from themselves, their worst selves in divorces, while making sure they're not being taken advantage of on the other side. So it is a balancing act, and most of the best family law attorneys, we walk a very thin line of having enough empathy and caring about our clients to really move their cases and move their lives forward, but not having so much empathy that their lives are eating me from the inside out.
Yeah. You have to kind of have a barrier of this isn't my life. Like I always am like, it's not my circus. It's not my monkeys. It's not my circus. It's, because you kind of do have to do that. But I also think, and I'll ask you this question, but I'll tell you my answer first so that I'll give you some time to think. But one additional question, then we'll talk about you. And I think we're probably good for today. There's one question that I encourage people to ask their attorney before they hire them, right? And so so you think about what you would suggest to ask. I think a good question to ask is, how many cases do you settle? Like not on the courtroom steps, right? Not the day before the trial, but how often are you willing to try to settle it during it? Because I have found that the areas, and how much do you know, like if this is a complex financial situation, like, do you know these issues? Do you know what a double dip is or whatever? But I found that the attorneys that we have the hardest time with, right, are the ones that literally will never even try to settle, negotiate, have discussions until the very last minute. And then they'll be like, okay, now we're willing to settle. And so I think that sometimes is a red flag, especially if that doesn't align with your situation as a couple, because most people don't want to go to trial. They don't even want to threaten trial. And I understand the dynamics of negotiation. It's a good move. But I think nowadays we're kind of like, okay, if you can get two attorneys that can maybe work through this, do we have to go all the way to that process? But what is another question that maybe they could ask if they were going in to interview attorneys?
I usually tell my clients, or tell people on TikTok and things like that, is to ask them, either ask them how much they enjoy the area of law they're doing, or what made them get into this area of law. Because especially in family law, family law is an area of law that attorneys either love it or they hate it, and it's just something they got nailed into and they make good money at it. No attorney can either hide the smile. I smile, and then attorneys that hate family law, they can't hide that disdain that they have for family law. You do not want an attorney that disdains the practice or area of law that you need them for. I'm on the phone with opposing counsels in my cases on Fridays, Saturdays, Sundays, on vacations. I've prepped for trials off the side of a cruise boat in Cozumel, Mexico. So it's one of those things where, I got into family law because I had a daughter out of wedlock very young. My parents got divorced when I was 12. So I saw a really nasty divorce unfold in front of me. And in my opinion, of course, I wasn't privy to everything, but in my opinion, divorce attorneys that took advantage of the situation and decided to go to trial, where in most of my cases, especially with children, I do everything. If it's possible to settle, I'll settle those cases, because you don't want a judge deciding your child's future, A. B, you're going to have to deal with this person for the rest of their life. They're the father or the mother of your child. So if they're being outrageous, we're going to go to trial. But if it's just, you're going to have to give a little bit more, then usually it's best for your child.
Yeah. And I think the one thing that people cannot predict, I can't predict, you can't predict, is what the judge is going to do. And that's the piece that they're like, well, but do you think that they're going to, I can't give you, even if I've been in front of the judge, even if I've done a ton of different types of the same business or anything like that, it is just literally the unknown, and it's going to be based on your particular case. And so I think that is really helpful information. But before we leave, so you kind of touched on it a little bit, because the reality is everybody in my space hates divorce too. Like everybody, all attorneys and all the experts, they all hate divorce. And so if you're in this space and you're in it, because we do have to like calm it down,
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I remember I posted something. I don't think I've told this on the podcast, but it's at the end. So who knows if anybody's listening anymore. But I put out something on social media about divorce on Easter Sunday. I wasn't thinking like, I'm a good sometimes practicing Catholic, but I
Right.
legit was just like in the mode, a hustle mode, right? So I was
Yeah.
like, I'm sitting at home. It's Easter. Like I'm getting ready to eat. Maybe I should say, hey, if you want to get divorced, da da da. My husband, so like family members started texting my husband. And then like even my husband's like, why did you post about? And people on the social were like, do we need to know something about? And I was like, oh yeah. So divorce is just kind of my field. Like it's not good or bad. Like people have choices. You have a choice who you love. You have a choice who you don't love anymore. And I'm okay with that. And so I took it down though, because I think that we in this space, like we are okay with it because we are okay with it in some capacity, either our own history or we're just okay with people having decisions. But I think that not everybody does. So tell us more about you, the work you do, and how people can reach out to you. And they should follow you on TikTok because it's kind of fun.
Yes, you could definitely follow me TikTok at GA Lawyer. That's definitely the best place to keep up with me. I don't even keep up with Facebook that much anymore. If you want to know what's going on in my daily life, check out TikTok. And you can reach out on our website, KF Law LLC in the state of Georgia. My About Me page is on there, and you can read all about my pedigree or my I totally blanked. My evolution in this area of law and things like that. But I just truly love family law. I've talked about maybe getting into politics soon and making more of an impact as far as writing new bills and laws, because especially in the state of Georgia, it is a lot harder for fathers. And I fight for fathers all the time. And it's a very uphill battle, but I really love advocating. Even if it's a position that I, in my personal life, might not agree with, I think it makes me even all that better at arguing that position, because I know how the other side's going to absolutely destroy that argument, so I can safeguard against that. But each case is different, and you can't treat family law cases like a farm. I would definitely tell people, try not to go to these big firms. I know they're great. I know they've got like their, Procter Gamble and, King and Spalding. They're those big, nice names, but you don't want to farm out your divorce law. You need a personal touch, someone that's going to answer emails on the weekends and things like that. It really is a calling to practice family law. And if you don't have a family law attorney that doesn't feel that way, then find a new one. Just because you hire an attorney doesn't mean you have to stay with them the entire way through. If you don't trust them, if they don't respond to you for whatever reason, you don't have to explain, in fact, to your attorney why you want to go in a different direction. That is absolutely your choice. Don't feel like you have to explain, and find the perfect attorney for you, because divorce is extremely personal, because the person that you told all your deepest, darkest secrets to, that you never thought would see the light of day, how to get rid of a body, how you would commit murder, all that great stuff that you guys were having joking conversations. Well, that person that knows everything about you, knows exactly how to attack you, is now on the other side. And it is extremely painful emotionally if you don't have the right attorney.
Yeah, totally agree with that. I think that that's just a little bit different when the client talks to me. I say, do not tell me that you killed somebody and buried the body. Okay. This is not privileged information. Like I'm
Right.
going to have to block out that you just told me that, but I'm still going to know it. So, like I've had clients that are like, So do I need to it was a business expense, but it was like, at a high-end kind of red light district kind of place, and like it was a business expense, and I was like, okay, stop.
Yeah.
I don't want to talk to your attorney.
Well, you should definitely move down here, Melissa, because the state of Georgia has an accountant client privilege.
Oh, so, there you go.
There you go.
Yeah, when you become an expert witness, it's like everything. Although somebody was telling me something the other day and they're like, "Oh, I think it's confidential." I was like, "Everything that is in my brain is confidential. Like I can't tell anything to anybody at this point." So, but I've enjoyed this. It was fabulous information, and hopefully people will go follow you on TikTok or even get on TikTok. I've been telling a lot of old people lately to get on TikTok, and they're like, just don't listen to me. I think it's very entertaining. I learn a lot of I learn a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, but you're actually creating content. You have hundreds of thousands of followers. Like she's legit, guys. So anyway, I appreciate it. And we'll have you back some other time to talk about or maybe even more fun stuff. Like I want to know more about the dark side of divorce. No, I'm just kidding.
Yes.
Thanks, Calina. We appreciate it.
Sounds good. Thanks. Bye.